In our first video, the video where we talked about chemistry, we also briefly discussed the concept of properties. And in this video, we will be discussing the four major types of these properties: physical and chemical properties, along with extensive and intensive properties. But before we jump in, let's quickly revise the definition of properties. So, the properties of any matter are its characteristics, which are observable and measurable, and they define that matter in every single way possible. For example, mass describes how much matter we have, volume describes how much space this matter occupies, flammability tells us whether this matter can catch fire or not, and pH of a substance describes how much acidic, basic, or neutral that substance is. And together, all of these properties define a matter and make it distinguishable from other matters. So now that we know what the properties of matter are, let's understand the different types of these properties. The first two types of properties we'll discuss are physical and chemical properties. The main difference between these two types of properties is the manner in which they both are studied. Physical properties don't need any chemical reaction to be studied, whereas chemical properties will always require a chemical reaction for them to be studied. A chemical reaction is any process that changes the composition or the chemical structure of a substance, or in other words, transforms that substance into another substance. Let's suppose we want to classify these two properties into their respective categories. To do this, we first have to understand how both of these properties are studied. To study the mass of an object, let's say this wooden block, we will simply put this block on a balance and measure its mass. On the other hand, if we want to study whether this block is flammable or not, we have to burn it. And burning this wooden block will change its composition and convert it into other substances such as ash and smoke. Therefore, we can say that because measuring the mass of this block didn't need any chemical reaction and didn't bring any chemical change in the composition or the chemical structure of this wooden block, therefore mass is a physical property, whereas studying the flammability of this wooden block has converted into ash and smoke. Therefore, the flammability is a chemical property. Boiling point is another example of physical properties. To measure the boiling point of a matter, let's say water, you just have to increase the temperature until it boils. And even though during this process, the water gets converted into steam, but it will still be considered a physical property because steam and water are both essentially the same matter. On the other hand, corrosivity is a chemical property because to see if a substance is corrosive or not, it must come into contact with another matter. And when that happens, it will corrode the other matter, and while doing this, it will also be converted into another substance. Therefore, we say that any property of matter that doesn't need a chemical reaction for it to be studied will be classified as a physical property, and the property that requires a chemical reaction for it to be studied will be classified as a chemical property. And these are some examples of physical and chemical properties. The second category of properties include extensive properties and intensive properties. The main difference between these two types of properties is their dependence on the amount of matter being studied. Extensive properties depend on the amount of matter, while intensive properties don't. To further understand this difference, let's take these two properties and try to classify them into their respective categories. Mass is a property that depends on the amount of matter being studied. If you increase the amount of matter, the value of mass will always go up. Let's suppose the mass of this water is 100 grams. But if we increase the amount of water, the mass will also be increased to, let's say, 500 grams. And because the mass and the amount of this water has a relationship, we can classify mass as an extensive property. On the other hand, boiling point of this water is its intensive property. Because it doesn't matter how much water you have, under standard conditions, it will always boil at 100 degrees Celsius. Similarly, volume is also an extensive property of matter. The more matter you have, the more will be its volume. However, the density of a matter will be its intensive property, because under constant conditions, the density of a matter will never change. Then these are some more examples of extensive and intensive properties. And that concludes our discussion. In the next video, we will discuss the basic concepts of the atom. And after that, we will discuss Bohr's atomic model and quantum mechanical atomic model. So see you in the next video. Until then, peace.